this is Beyond the Basics, and we are going to be actually using Poway Unified's IEP document, redacted, in order to hopefully have families get comfortable seeing the document, comfortable with the questions that it's asking, so that you as parents, family members, and maybe even students, if there's any tonight in the audience, can feel more comfortable being to have involvement in the process. So I'm going to start with just a little about who's here in the room. We have Mario Garcia is going to be serving as our simultaneous Spanish interpreter. I'm helped tremendously by Joe Goyos, who is my colleague at the Exceptional Family Resource Center. I want to recognize that we have Director of Special Education today with us, so thank you for being here. And then my name is Maura. I am going to do hopefully some of the talking tonight. This is a lot of information, so it is not necessarily the most interactive presentation, but there will be an opportunity for questions. I want to go over just a few tiny ground rules. We will utilize chat. With great chat comes great responsibility. So we really ask that you utilize the chat for questions or clarifications. I'm hoping that we can keep things very respectful so that between Joe and myself, we can be able to monitor the chat and address any like, oh, you didn't say what that acronym was, or I missed that part. So if we can just keep it to like the subject of the training, that would be really awesome. About me, I am not an attorney. I am not a credentialed educator. I am the parent of quite a few children. And so most of the information tonight is really kind of from that parent lens. The Exceptional Family Resource Center really tries to do trainings that are by parents, for parents. And again, if anything seems confusing or incorrect, please put it in the chat so that we can make sure that you leave with questions answered and feeling like more confident. We don't want to get people more confused. So,
Maura?
Yes.
Just let folks know that in the chat, we dropped the link to the slide deck, but I'm going to hit that send again, so you'll see it all show up in there if you want to follow along or have that for your own records.
Awesome. I was about to get to that we want you to know that we are also recording, so that we can make this recording available both to folks that attend tonight and also to people who might not have been able to join us. So again, the slide deck is available, and at the end you'll have my contact information, Joe's contact information, in order to make sure that if you have other questions, kind of sometimes they bubble up to the surface after a training, that you feel like you can get in touch with us. One other comment, this is beyond the basics, but this is not everything. This is not everything in the kitchen sink. This is not the minutia. I want you also to remember we did a session 1 and we covered assessment, present levels of educational performance, goals, services, and placement at that session. So if you're joining us and this is session 2 and you missed session 1, we do have it in a recorded format that you can kind of fill in the gaps. So our purpose tonight is really going to be to give you information that's very specific about 9 sections of the IEP. And we want to make sure that we present the information in a very coherent way. And so we will, again, kind of funnel those questions to the end. Okay. So again, I want to just hammer home, we want you to be familiar with the IEP form. We want you to understand the purpose of the portion that we're talking about. We want always for families to feel like they have a meaningful involvement in the IEP process. And we want you to know where to get more help. Okay. And of course, we are the Exceptional Family Resource Center, so there will be at the end some resources. So these are the 9 sections we are going to cover in the next hour and change. And if you previously did attend the IEP Basics, this slide is exactly the same slide from that training. The green stars, where you see the green stars, those are sections that will be discussed for every student that is deemed eligible for an IEP. Like if we're creating an IEP for a student, those sections will be discussed. The blue stars are there to denote those sections of the IEP that are going to depend on the age or the grade level of a particular student. So you may not do the blue sections every single time, but we want you to know about them. They're that important. And then the orange stars on the slide, those little faint orange stars, are there to tell you about the portions of the IEP that depend on the student's individual needs. And of course, the whole IEP depends on the student's individual needs, but these sections aren't for every single student, but for students who need them, they are ready to roll, okay? So we're gonna start with the portions of the IEP that we consider for every single student with an IEP. And again, when I do show forms, those are the forms that PUSD does utilize. So we are going to start with assistive technology. Before I start though, I want to just remind folks that all the parts of a district's offer of a free and appropriate public education are important. And so when we talk about parent involvement, we are really talking about throughout the entire process. And more, my message to families is like, it's what happens between IEP meetings that is super important. Like, we don't want to save everything and then come and just dump it on the IEP table or on the IEP Zoom. We want to be able to have meaningful communication that's productive between those meetings so that when we come together, we have a shared understanding of the student. And so just like any other part of an IEP, the district can have policies and procedures. They can have a way of doing things, but no matter what, the individual unique needs and the goals of the student are going to drive those IEP team discussions and the decisions that are made. So with all of that kind of baseline, we're going to talk about assistive technology first. So here you are introducing the Poway Unified Special Factors section. The first question that we are going to be faced is, does the student require assistive technology devices and or services? And that's the yes or no answer, the first one of our training this evening. So this is important to document for families, even in some cases, if it's available to all students in a district. Now, that has a lot to unpack, so I want to be really clear. Many school districts have a one-to-one technology policy that's in effect, where every general education student, of which special education students are also general education students first, they all are given access. This became really obvious, of course, during the pandemic. However, some of our students that have IEPs do need something that is already built into that technology. This can be documented here because the way I like to think about it is, if a tornado came to San Diego, grabbed my child up and took them to Kansas, because of course the tornado comes to California, grabs them, brings them back to Kansas, dumps them out. Maybe Kansas doesn't have a one-to-one technology policy. We need to at least document that piece that is absolutely critical for a student to be able to access the curriculum. Not they must have one-to-one technology, not they must have all these other pieces, but if there is a significant need that is addressed through, even if it's technology everybody has, if it's addressing a specific need of the student for access, it is useful to have that noted. Now, okay, so that's a pretty specific, like, it's a specific need. That's my big thing. We want them to know in Kansas, if you had to come with your IEP, this student needs this hardware, or this student needs, let's say, text to speech. Just the need. It doesn't have to be drama, doesn't have to be a big deal, but just that we've noted it. Again, that means the student is utilizing it routinely. It is necessary for access, not just they have a device. Okay. So adaptive equipment is also something that we would consider assistive technology. It can be used for things like accessing the environment, things like positioning that we might provide for accessing specific activities, eating or feeding while at school. Another example could be that an OT or an occupational therapist may determine that a student is exceedingly distracted by noise in an instructional setting. And so that occupational therapist may request a pair of sound dampening headphones for a student to use when in class, or perhaps only when the fire alarm or the fire drill is going on. So we really want to document, again, those specific materials or items that a student needs to access the environment, to participate in the curriculum, those two things. So I'm going to give an example of another kind of assistive technology that maybe some of you have heard of, and that is an augmentative alternative communication, or an AAC device. So for some students who are relying on like total communication, who may not have developed a lot of oral communication skills yet, we might have a device that assists them in producing spoken language. So this might suggest a lot of consultation, a lot of collaboration between family, professionals, usually a speech language pathologist or speech therapist is involved. And this will also need to be worked with special education staff and general education staff as well. So that you really start to see this is a complicated situation. And again, this is where this section would be able to record a student who has those kind of needs. It's going to record the kind of device, whether it's hardware and software, and sometimes what kind of collaboration, what kind of other training, maintenance, those kinds of things can be recorded. So the other thing I like to mention before we go into more detail about assistive technology is that students don't always know how to use, like we give them a tool, but without explaining or teaching them how to be successful using that tool, it just sits in their toolbox. So this may be, I'm going to go back to that AAC device. Some students need that explicit instruction, and sometimes that looks like a goal that we're going to teach the student this skill, or it may be kind of embedded in a modification, an accommodation with a level of prompt that is required. So that is kind of the first step of assistive technology, and we are going to look at some examples. The slide just got way more entertaining, didn't it? So I wanted to give you the full picture of what assistive technology could be, and with the reminder that it isn't always high tech, that lots and lots of things that are a little less on the technological side and just as important to students. And we think about students with some of our low incidence disabilities that are really, they use a lot of technology. Things like mobility, fine motor skill disabilities, deafness, visual impairments, things like book holders, special magnifiers, microphones, text magnification, all of that still lives inside of the assistive technology umbrella. The other thing is assistive technology can be things like a sand timer for a student that needs like a visual timer. It could be special paper. Sometimes you may have seen like occupational therapy will take highlighters to help students know where to place their letters. Sometimes they'll use thin little ribbons of glue to give texture. So it really just depends. What is this student's need? How often do they need it? Under what conditions do they need it? Those little grips on pens, like as you can see, it's kind of, if a student needs it to be successful at, say it with me, accessing the space or accessing the curriculum, it might be assistive technology. And I must note that up in that top right-hand corner, software is also potentially assistive technology. One little mention that I would make is that what is the most important thing for the IEP team to describe is the function that a piece of software or hardware serves. So a team might say, we're not going to write iPad, like Air, we're going to write a word processor that is compatible with a speech to text, blah, blah, blah. Like, so they're going to describe the function, because if you move somewhere else, we want your student to be able to have the need met. We don't want a school district to be like, we don't work with Macs, or we don't want, like, we want to make it as smooth, seamless, and flexible as we can. Okay, so I've just covered AT-ish. We're going to move on to probably the biggest, most important topic that we all face as parents, and that is really learning to be fluent in the language of accommodations and modifications. I am hoping that some of you are looking at me. I see Michael. I'm going to put you on the spot a little. Do you know the difference? All you have to do is say, yes, I feel confident, or no, I'm not quite sure. You don't have to say the definition. And Michael.
Yeah, a little bit. I know the difference. Yeah.
Okay, good. So my goal tonight is that you are going to leave feeling way more confident. So you felt like a 5. So here we go. Let's see if we get to 10. So a student who is receiving an accommodation means that the IEP is adjusting the environment or some minimal aspect of the activity, whereas when we talk about modifications, the IEP adjusts the instructional objectives substantially. So going back, accommodation, the demand is the same. The mastery of the standard, not changed. When we go to modify, we are actually changing the demand, and the standard itself is altered. So when I think of accommodation, a student can be within a different group of students, can be in a different setting, but the content and difficulty is exactly that of the general education environment. When we talk about modifications, the student can be in general ed or in a separate setting, but it doesn't matter where they are, because the content and difficulty of instruction varies, has been manipulated to be diminished from that of the same aged non-disabled peers. So when we think about accommodations, we're looking for a way to make it the same, to accommodate. Modify means we are changing it. And so sometimes we hear it and we think that they're the same because they're said so often together. And we really, really, really tonight want to know that those are very different things, and I'll tell you why. Well, the first reason that it's important is that accommodations only tend to suggest that a student is probably staying on that, what we would call like a regular diploma track. When we look at that other picture, like we look at the one on the left, it looks like a pretty busy classroom, full of students learning, full of students just, interacting. When we look on the right-hand side, we can see that there are some very significant changes to the setting, but we also see that for the age of the students, like if we're presuming they're the same, that information is being presented probably at a different pacing, probably at a maybe less information at a time, maybe it's chunked, and we can see that students are working probably on more individualized goals, okay, just kind of visually. So relying on a modified curriculum over the course of many years can make it difficult or challenging for a student to catch up to grade level. So that is a very broad statement. That is, again, I'm saying over the course of years, not 1 or 2 years, but I mean over the course of years, if students are not having exposure and content and all of the lessons that make up general education, then it can be challenging, okay? So when we think, one comment I do want to make is that California they have taken steps to move away from or to move toward the elimination of something called the certificate of completion. Students who have what we would consider the most complex support needs will still have the opportunity to receive a diploma while they still remain eligible for services until approximately their 22nd birthday. So I want to go back to this idea of modifications. Some teams think and again, I don't want to speculate, but I'll just talk about myself. When my children were moving into, like, let's say special education preschool, and back then there was kind of this, okay, we're gonna have separate settings and it'll be safe for your child. Like, there'll be fewer kids and we can kind of keep an eye on your child, and we can provide all these supports, and it sounds, like a little bubble for students. And that can be very well intentioned, but what I'm challenging families to think about is that access to the Common Core state standards and general education is kind of this bigger idea, does give something to students. And so I want families to think about the following words tend to be associated with that classroom on the left: report cards and grades, classroom assessments, or like whole class screeners, assessments, standards. You hear the word standards a lot in that class on the left. We also think about like standardized testing or statewide testing. Lots of discussion about getting ready for statewide testing. When we look at the classroom on the right, and again, nothing's wrong with it, but knowing what your student is, where your student's placement, what it entails, I think it's important that families go into this well-informed. So, alternative assessment, maybe. Environmental text. Functional, words like functional, whether it's math, functional communication. Sometimes we hear adapted or the word modified when it's applied to curriculum. Sometimes you hear supplemental. Sometimes you'll hear multi-skills. Anything that says it's not credit earning or not diploma credit earning, that indicates that it is probably relying on a modified curriculum. Okay. So let's talk about like some examples, like get into the nitty-gritty. So when we talk about accommodations, my first like parent-to-parent tip is be specific. That what we don't want is to put everything on the IEP, lots and lots and lots of accommodations, such that nobody could reasonably remember all the details. We want to pick things that are very critical, that we know have a major, like a pretty significant impact on our student and their success. So when I see a word like preferential seating, that makes me go, well, that's a nice start, but what kind of preferential seating are you talking about? If I have a student with some significant behavior, maybe that means seated by adult supervision, like putting their seat wherever the teacher is likely to be. It could also, if we have a student with like extreme anxiety, for example, that student might feel most comfortable in a back corner where they can have some communication without words with teachers, where they can easily take a break without a lot of notice from his or her peers. It could also mean that a student, because of their vision or their hearing, needs to be up front wherever the instruction is happening or to be able to see the board. But it can also mean that we're being more flexible about the way we think about preferential seating, and we're thinking more about what peer are we paired with, so that we get that positive language modeling or that positive behavioral modeling. Okay, so just those two words, preferential seating, it's like what kind? So just kind of thinking more deeply, like if we're going to write it in the IEP, we want it to matter, and we want to know, we want that teacher who gets it to know exactly what we're expecting. So if we look at a modifications example, we think about a student who's assigned to a subset of a lengthy assignment. Like, to me, that makes it a little bit less than. If we're thinking about spelling words, if we have one student learning 5 spelling words a week, while the rest of the class is learning 20, over the course of the year, the demand on that student was not the same. Okay. When we think about learning different material and concepts, while the rest of the class is doing something like, let's say, double-digit multiplication, if we have a student in the class working on math manipulatives to, for a single digit equation, then that is substantially different. Another one might be that a student who's working on being pulled out, is working, but they are receiving this instruction maybe for literacy, that it's a specific curriculum. It is not what the rest of the class is working on. Again, still meeting an IEP goal, still addressing a need. It's just not necessarily what the rest of the class is working on. The other one that I wanted to touch on is this idea of extended time. So this is as a parent who has one 15-year-old and the rest of them have exited IEP land, are adults. I like to take a second and reflect what extended time can do. For some students, extended time is just super critical. However, what's really important also, in my opinion, is to use it with discretion. It's like best in moderation. If a student just relies always on extended time, they are always a little bit out of sync with their peers. And they also, in the age of Canvas or those, any other online system where they can see all their assignments stacking up, when they are 2 days behind, that list of late assignments or overdue assignments, they come out in red, they attack your face, and it can be really overwhelming. So not that it's not an appropriate accommodation, but it's one that sometimes we have to talk to our children, like, look, you don't want to have all your assignments late. You want to try to stay with the class. And if you need to use the accommodation, it's available for you to utilize. So just a parent-to-parent tip, especially for those of you who might have, emerging high schoolers. The goal also of learning to use these accommodations in real life is that these accommodations, if students go on to post-secondary education, community college, university, whatnot, those are available still in the form of academic accommodation letters for most of those post-secondary institutions. The difference is that the student will need to do a lot more work in order to obtain the academic accommodations, and they will need to communicate every single time they're going to use an accommodation. So that's another reason that it's really helpful for parents to work with schools to, again, making sure we're using only the accommodations that the student needs, and that we're helping students to learn to self-advocate for those accommodations and to recognize the relationship between the accommodation and what it does for them. What help is this accommodation providing? Why do I need it? Okay, sorry, I will hush on that. This is where I get see what's coming. So accommodations typically fall into 4 categories. Setting, so what are we going to do to the environment to make the student better able to access material or access the curriculum? Presentation, and that's usually what's happening while the teacher's teaching that's going to help the student. Response, this is usually where we get in the time and a half for testing or extra time. This is what has to change about the way the student responds or completes a task. And then the last one, and these tend to be available pretty much all the time, these are any of the behavioral strategies, whether it is having a choice board or having positive reinforcement schedules. Those things tend to have to be in place across the day. Okay. One last thing, just because I like to hit it home until people go, okay, we got it. And I don't feel like people are like, oh, we got it already. If you, as the parent, cannot remember all of your child's accommodations or modifications, then I would say it is unlikely that a general education teacher with 25 to 35 students is going to be able to remember them either. So that's kind of my gauge. Can you remember all of those accommodations? Then that's probably the right number. When we start to go, oh my gosh, I can't keep track of them all, they're really hard to implement in a general education class. So again, thoughtful selection, really deep consideration, specificity. Those are my parent-to-parent tips. So here's what the actual document looks like. As you can see, I don't have the cleanest copy, but it will be under supplementary aids and services and other supports. And then it is an opportunity for the team to discuss what is the accommodation, make it as specific as they need to. They will talk about start date and end date. And again, frequency, duration, location. Those are pretty common descriptors within the IEP. And those are descriptors we talked about during session 1. Okay, we're also going to talk a little bit about something called supports to staff. And this is really looking at the specific training consultation that the team finds that a staff working with the student will require. So this can be thinking, this is like the tiptoeing into, do we need specific support at a particular time of day for a particular activity, for a particular purpose for this student? The other thing that this can allow us is an opportunity to talk about like staff to staff consultation. So it comes, sometimes you'll hear the word collaboration. That's when multiple professionals are working together with, on a particular, maybe a particular goal, a particular kind of activity. Sometimes you'll hear the word consultation, and that's where a person with particular expertise is typically providing consultation, providing that expertise to, sometimes it's the special education, SAI teacher, ed specialist, case manager, pick a word. Sometimes it's with general educators. So that is consultation. Okay, so we're moving into the next section already, yay. Portions of the IEP that apply only to students of certain grades and ages. Okay, and in this section, we're going to talk about statewide testing, which is everybody's most scintillating topic, as well as the individual transition plan. So notice that these are not specific to any particular federal disability category. Again, the district is able to utilize policies and procedures so long as those unique needs of the student are being honored. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, again, statewide testing and participation. So I did put a little star. Children that are less than 5 years old have their own version of statewide assessments. I want to draw your attention to those. And as you see those arrows, there's a lot of sections, and it seems like grades 3 to 8, prime time. Lots of statewide assessments happening. And then again, grade 11. Then you see like 5-8 high school. So it's a fluid conversation. It's one that you should be spending some portion of the IEP making sure that that is updated. And this is my confession. This was the part of the IEP meeting that I didn't feel as engaged in when I was a young parent. And so don't be like me, which is why I'm doing this presentation. So I also want to cover that there is English language proficiency assessments, LPAC. So that is part of the statewide testing. And then there is an alternate LPAC. So when I get to talking about the alternate assessments, this is the equivalent alternate assessment of the English language proficiency assessment of California. Okay. Glancing, there's a lot of names, not a lot of action. So I will continue. And here we are, alternate assessment. It is on a computer. It occurs with a trained test examiner in a one-to-one setting. And so this, when we hear the word alternate assessment, it is for only those students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, okay? And this is a way to, the process that we're going to talk about ensures that schools do not divert a student with a disability to an alternate assessment, perhaps to avoid a score being reported. The California Department of Education recommendation is approximately 1% of students would use this California alternate assessment. And the real issue that I want you to hear is parent participation in this decision is really important. Okay, so we're talking about statewide testing. It is important. Yes, you have the right to opt out. However, that affects the usefulness both to like the state, it affects the usefulness to your school board members when they look at data, and it affects the usefulness of that data to people making decisions about whether programs are working well or not. So I just put it out there like there's kind of that social benefit or societal benefit of great participation. So, and you still have the choice. So for students in high school, it is also important when we talk about statewide testing to know that if your child, son or daughter, is not using an accommodation within their testing environment in high school, it is very hard, near impossible to then suddenly say to, like, let's say the college boards, oh, I want to use that for the AP test, or oh, I want to, have this accommodation for the ACT. It needs to, there needs to be evidence that that is a necessary accommodation prior to requesting its use for the college entrance exams. Let's go to the next slide, shall we? We're going to talk about the Individualized Transition Plan, the ITP. And right now, the IEP prior to your child's 16th birthday, an ITP needs to be developed. At that time, the invitation must be extended to the student to participate in their IEP meeting. The purpose of the ITP is to make sure that we are starting to think about what your child's goal, like end goal from high school. So up until this point, we always think about goals as being 1 year away. When we start writing ITP goals, they're a little bit more distant, maybe a little bit less specific. They are going to identify post-exit goals for employment and education. And then for some students, it may be appropriate to also include one about independent living. So I do want to just give you like an example. So it might say, Charlie, after graduating high school, is going to, participate in a community college program. That's what it might sound like. So that would be like that post-secondary education goal is just saying, 6 years from now, Charlie wants this. And so then it helps us to start to go, we need to align all the other things we're doing in the IEP to these big, sometimes audacious, sometimes very simple goals. Okay. And that QR code, I believe, goes to my very favorite transition Padlet. So just so you know what that is. So again, we're looking for a seamless transition between being a K-12 or, up until age 22 student, and then moving into the big world of whatever the world looks like for that particular student, whether it's continuing on to post-secondary education and being ready to advocate for their own academic accommodation letter and pursue whatever their goals and dreams are, or whether it means we have a student who's maybe a Department of Rehabilitation client who wants to enter the world of work immediately and might need some of those supports, or maybe it's a person with significant support needs that is also a regional center consumer who also needs to be connected to what comes next. So that's really the goal, is that we are planning ahead so that upon exit from the local education agency, we are ready for whatever comes next. Okay. The ITP process should look familiar if you attended the first training, which was IEP Basics. Assessment, helps us identify needs. The needs are going to drive those ITP goals, even if they are fairly prescriptive. And then services, and then we have this interesting activities. So that's kind of, besides the service, there's going to be activities that might be resume building, it might be some work experience, but we start to see it could be exploring careers, those kinds of things. So now we're going to reveal Poway's ITP document. So as you see, the first part of it is mostly looking at those post-secondary goal, possible as appropriate, post-secondary goal for independent living. And then it really tries to tie the services, the activities that are going to support it, community experiences, those kinds of things. Then we get to page 2, and this is really going to look kind of at the course of study. It's going to look at where's the student in terms of graduation requirements. There's going to be a discussion perhaps. Right now it says certificate of completion, but it might have different kinds of diploma pathways in its next iteration. When we see right now that certificate of completion, again, that matches up with a student who has an alternate assessment. Those are students who are most likely appropriate for more of a certificate of completion. And again, this is an opportunity to look at how are we connecting with agencies. So on this third page, I want to highlight top, age of majority. There is an obligation for the school district to advise the students that they will assume their educational rights when they turn 18. Okay, so that's kind of a big deal. And it's a big deal for parents. And so you see the next section says, is the student conserved? On the QR code on the left side is what I have linked to, something called the rights transfer notice. It's an alternative to conservatorship that would allow the student to be supported in his or her decision making under IDEA. Okay, and I believe it's a Disability Rights California document. This is not good for college though, just under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then we have some indicators. Indicator number 13 is, I'm not even going to go into that. Just know it's an indicator of quality education, but these are questions to make sure that the school district has done the pieces of the ITP that are critical. Okay. So secret, those should be yes. That's the answer, yes. On the next page, I wanted to give you some links to the Transition Partnership Program and the Workability Program for your district. This other QR code takes you to a workshop on post-secondary goals. That's also a Poway presentation. So don't wait until your child is getting ready to exit to learn about transition. Workability is funded by the California Department of Education. I think activities start as early even as middle school, I believe, in your district. And then TPP, so again, that Transition Partnership Program, is a contract through the Department of Rehabilitation, and it is available at all 5 Poway comprehensive high schools, last I looked. Yes, I believe. And so one last mention is that we are expecting that the age for ITPs is going to reduce, and that students will start to have them developed by their 14th birthday, but that has not started yet. So that's why the slides still say 16.
Maura, perfect time to answer a quick question that came in the chat. Why 14?
Why 14? Because the state is saying that we think 14, but I can give you the other reason, which is, again, I will talk about myself. If we wait until a child is 16 to talk about transition, that for some of our students is sophomore year, but for other students, that's their junior year. And if they are on track to graduate with a regular diploma, they are exiting with like a year a year and a half of transition activities to think about transition. And so we really want to have that bumped up so that those students have a little more time. The other thing we're finding is that it's easier in some ways to think about 14 because that's the age where we're really looking at that middle school to high school transition. And that's kind of a natural point to start talking about, like, hey, what's the course of study going to look like? What are your child's goals? What do you want? What do they want to be when they grow up? And so really having those conversations and then being able to have coherent decision making throughout high school. That would be my quick answer. Yes? Any other questions about that in the chat? Okay. So thank you for staying with me. We would do exercises right now, but I'm going to power on. Portions of the IEP that are included precisely because of student needs and circumstances. So you will see there are 5 sections in this section. Ugh, sorry, sections and sections, but here we go. This is extended school year, transportation, low incidence disabilities, behavior intervention plans, and English language learners. And I know you can read the slides, but I also know that there's a few parents that are probably multitasking. So that's why I want to provide access by doing a little read aloud. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is the extended school year. And the purpose has a lot of long words in it. The purpose is to reduce the impact of regression and recoupment between consecutive school years. So we're going to first pull apart that. Regression is to lose skills because we don't practice them. Recoupment is to regain the lost thing. So first we start with almost every student loses some skill during a break. They experience that regression. Examples galore. They forget how to write things in their planner, or they forget how to use their inside voice. They need some practice, some reminder. So typically what we think about is when regression is more than expected, when the time that it takes to recover is more than what's anticipated. And so I'm not going to give you specific numbers, but just generally speaking, I hear words like 6 weeks. We kind of expect it to take 6 weeks to kind of get back to where they were. If we're losing a lot of skill, if those skills are critical skills like communication, serious behavior kinds of things, we really start to look at, okay, the student might need some support during those breaks. So what extended school year is not? It is not enrichment activity. It is not required, and it is also not credit recovery. And credit recovery is typically something we talk about for high schoolers. It is also not a continuation exactly of the year, in that we might have a different teacher, a different classroom, different bell times, certainly fewer hours of instruction, and typically you'll have some like shifting staff assignments. One way that I like families to think about ESY is if everybody is invited, that's not ESY, because ESY is an IEP team decision. And there's the form. And this form is pretty intensive. Eligibility. So typically students that are in special classes or separate settings, that's typically, but not always. And then students whose IEP has to specify ESY as determined by their IEP team. So you're not eligible just by being in a special class. You're eligible because not only do you have the need, but the IEP team has like supported that need. So we see things like a disability that's going to continue indefinitely for a prolonged period. Interruption of the program causes regression with limited recoupment capacity. Those are the kinds of words that you see. They need to be impossible, unlikely, of attaining self-sufficiency without ESY. So one small point though, the lack of clear evidence of those factors may not be used to deny a student ESY. if the IEP team determines the need for the program and puts it in the IEP. And that's just a fancy way of saying everything goes back to your IEP team. The next page of ESY eligibility and the summary is that it must be at least equivalent to summer school days that are offered and hours, summer school days and hours offered to students without disabilities. And so again, this kind of tends to come up when we talk about credit recovery for high school students. If there is a 6-week program for a high school student receiving general education, typically we will see that mirrored in the ESY offer. Again, that doesn't mean that they're equivalent, but that we are having a parity between those two, between a student with disabilities and a student without. Typically, ESY will run about 20 days, including holidays, and it'll be comparable quality and scope to regular school. However, keep in mind, the purpose of ESY is maintenance. So sometimes families will be like, where's my report card? Where's my progress notes? Where's my, like they want to see like, oh, what did my child learn? The goal of ESY from my lips to your ears is maintenance. It is not to like, oh, we're going to like go above and beyond and catch up and get ahead. It is not that. It is to maintain a skill. Okay, any comments? I think everybody's on. Okay. Special education transportation, the yellow bus is here. So a student with a disability requiring transportation in order to access their educational environment, then transportation magically becomes a related service. It is incredibly complicated how this happens, but let's go through some of the basics. So for the IEP team, we are looking at level of service, and there needs to be a discussion of like safety considerations. It will typically think about the individual's route. There may be discussion about pickup and drop-off locations, and those may not be an IEP team decision. Often that is determined by a lot of rules and regulations that govern transportation, including liability, including is that a safe drop-off? And so some of that needs to be like is a little more technical. When transportation is offered, when the IEP team is placing your student at a location other than your school of residence, in order for your child to receive the special education services and support that your child needs, that is when the IEP team is more likely to introduce a discussion about transportation. If you are applying for an intra-district transfer, if you are going through choice process, whatever your district calls it, I think intra-district transfer is correct. If you are requesting a release from one school in order to go to a different district, if you are opting for a charter school that is not named Poway, then you are in essence giving up or forfeiting special education transportation from Poway. Okay. The other thing is that reimbursement, if the parent is providing transportation because transportation was not available, then you might be able to request it under very certain circumstances. Okay. Okay. So we're going to cover low incidence disabilities. These come up. People hear low incidence and they're like, hey, does my child have a low incidence disability? And so I think it's appropriate for folks to know. And so on this slide are the federal education definitions of low incidence disabilities. They include deaf blindness, deafness, hearing impairment, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, and then visual impairment, including blindness. So these have like a very specific definition in IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then this is where you'll see it. It's just below the assistive technology question. It will ask about, does the student require low incidence services, equipment, and/or materials to meet educational goals. And so that's the place that the team will have that conversation. One of the biggest takeaways is that a low incidence credentialed staff member needs to attend an IEP that involves a low incidence student. Another thing, parent to parent, is that you are going to want support. It is hard. Special education is hard, can be very isolating for any family. And it is especially difficult when it's a student with a fairly unusual, rare kind of disability. And so there's relatively few families to learn from and to get to know. And so I think that's a really, if you do have a student with a low incidence disability, I really urge you to get in touch with us. We're happy to help make connections. It's really important to again, find other families. I want to also just go into instruction in Braille and the use of Braille for a student who is blind or visually impaired. Really is part of this discussion. Communication needs for a student who is deaf or hard of hearing. Again, that is really, really important. And then for a student with, let's say, a low incidence disability like multiple disabilities or orthopedic impairment, those specialized services, materials, and equipment, those are really critical discussions. So again, that's why we need that low incidence credentialed staff at those meetings. Okay, behavioral interventions. So this is my favorite slide. We have, does the student's behavior impede the learning of the student or others? And the team is asked yes or no. So yes, what it doesn't mean is that you have to have a behavior intervention plan. Yes does not mean BIP. That is a separate question. Does the team then decide? Yes, that's a separate, that's at the red arrow. Okay, so there's two different kinds of questions. Yeah, so while yes doesn't mean a BIP, it should put the idea of a BIP on your radar as a parent. And yes does absolutely mean that you should expect to see a behavior goal in your child's IEP. When we think about a behavior intervention plan, though, again, I cannot stand myself not to put this graphic in every slide that I can. You will have that feeling of like a mini IEP within the IEP in terms of there should be some sort of assessment, looking at data, looking at observations, identifying the needs. We might say identifying like that target behaviors and looking at the goal. Often we call that a functionally equivalent replacement behavior, or FERB goal. And then looking at what services, what supports, what strategies are we going to need to put in place for the student to be successful. And then it's a loop. Assessment, needs, goals, services, review. What else do we need to do? This is Poway's behavior intervention plan, just the first page. You'll see that they may or may not do a functional behavior assessment, not required. They could do data collection. They could have a social emotional assessment or some other way of getting information. It is going to cover predictors of the behavior. It's going to also look at what do we need to change about the environment. This is different than just an accommodation. This is really thinking strategically, like what do we need to do, the structure to make sure that this behavior doesn't just happen over and over again. And it's also going to ask the team to believe. So not know, but to believe, to make a pretty educated guess on why the behavior is occurring. And so those tend to be, I usually remember it as SEAT, sensory, escape, attention, tangibles. Okay, so we look at the next page because it keeps going, and I'm happy to see FERB is hanging out at the top, functionally equivalent replacement behavior. And that is simply, what is it we want the student to do instead of the target behavior, so the problematic behavior, and that's going to have the same effect for the student. The student is going to get those needs met in a different way. Okay, so on this page, we're going to really look at reinforcement procedures. We're going to look at reactive strategies. We're going to think strategically. How is the team going to teach that verb skill to the student? Other things that you can include in the discussion is like, what data do we need to collect? Criteria for maybe discontinuing intervention. Like, when do we know the BIP has worked and can be faded? And then sometimes we have to have a communication plan around behavior. Okay. And then parent to parent, a BIP, it is normal for a behavior intervention plan to require multiple adjustments. Just like in an IEP, we don't write a perfect IEP off the top. Sometimes we have to, shape and refine. We learn more, we make changes. Student grows, we make changes. So behavior is just as complex. So often the behavior plans need to be adjusted multiple times. Kids aren't robots. Adults aren't perfect. They don't mind read. So sometimes we have to circle back and say, hey, that reinforcer isn't working. Hey, that prompt, you're over prompting. Like, oh, there's a new behavior. All of that is normal. Okay. And family participation, crucial. So if you need, this is an opportunity for you to approach your team if you need more training, more information. Sometimes families will feel like, oh my gosh, my child, like we're having this conversation about behavior, and it can feel a little, I don't know, as a parent, it's like, oh, they think my child's bad. They don't think your child is bad. Behavior is just a form of communication. It is not about goodness or worth. It is your child is using this behavior to communicate. What are they telling us? And how can we help them meet their needs in a way that's more effective and productive? Okay. And shaping behavior takes time. Usually we always joke that our child's had this behavior for a very long time before we start to work on it. And it's going to take a very long time to unlearn that behavior. Okay. I think I covered all my little points on that. And we have reached the needs specific for English learners. IEP, and you see in the flag, IEP services should supplement, that is, add to, they should not supplant. That is, they shouldn't just be like substituted in, they should add to what English language development would be occurring for a general education student. So we see some considerations for all English learners, general education, all of them. Is the student classified as an English learner? If they are, we need to know what the current levels of proficiency in speaking and listening and writing and reading. And we need to have a conversation about where the student will receive designated ELD and integrated ELD. And then just for clarity, designated is instruction that's provided by the school at a time set aside in the regular school day for focused instruction for students that are English learners. And then when we talk about integrated, is instruction where the student is addressing their ELD needs in tandem or in combination with the Common Core state standards. Okay. So all those same interventions that a general education student would receive, a student that has an IEP who is also an English learner should be receiving also. And there's a few bullet points that I want to cover. So the first is that if a student, unless documentation shows that a student is equally proficient in their primary language and English, the student's IEP assessment should be conducted in their primary language. So unless that is clearly not feasible. So that's like the little asterisk. So if the assessor that is working with the student is not bilingual, then the district would provide an interpreter to support them. And then if you were at session 1, IEP Basics, you already heard me say that state law requires testing and assessment material be selected so that it is racially, culturally, and sexually not discriminatory. Okay. The next is if the primary language of the student or the family is not English, the family should be offered an interpreter for IEP meetings. When we have a conversation about those alternate assessments, so I came at it from the statewide testing angle, and now I'm circling back through the English learner lens. When we're talking about those alternate assessments, we are also considering whether alternate assessments for the statewide LPAC, English Language Proficiency Assessment, California, right? Time is, I'm forgetting my acronyms now. And so they should be specifying which alternate assessments will be needed. Always we are wanting to ensure that goals are linguistically appropriate to the linguistic level of the student, the cognitive level of the student, the developmental level of the student's primary or secondary language, and that they match that student's general ed needs, okay? And other thing is that the IEP the IEP team needs to notify the family of how to request a translated copy of the IEP in their primary language. So those are kind of specific things. Make sure that's off. Sorry about that. And now we are at the Poway Unified Special Factors page that addresses a student who is an English learner. And so you can see quite a few boxes to potentially check. And again, I don't know if Joe, you are able to drop in the chat the link to the slides just in case we had anyone join us after we did that the last time. And so we've reached the part where we, in our live in-person version of this workshop, we did a fun for some, awkward for others activity where we practiced something called power poses. This is from Dr. Amy Cuddy. I included this in here just so you could have access to the information. And then point by point, we have resources for each section that we covered tonight. If you want to do a deeper dive, as they like to say, and get more technical information, those are available. And then again, continuing, we go into extended school year, transportation, it keeps going. At the very end, you will see a resource that Joe and I both utilize quite a bit, and it is called the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities. It is put out by Disability Rights California. It is reviewed by attorneys, but it is in a very accessible format, kind of in a question and answer format. And it is available in a number of languages, including Spanish. And before we do questions, which we do have time for, I did want to just give us an opportunity to make sure you're aware of some other learning opportunities and also opportunities just for family support and camaraderie. So this one is a Spanish presentation about CalAble, which is a particular kind of account available to people with disabilities, qualifying disabilities. And so this is in our Parenting Hacks series, which is trying to make life a little easier and demystify programs and services for people with disabilities through EFRC. And all of these things that I'm about to show you are free with one exception, and I'll cover it when we get to it. This is on the same night. Joe and I are dividing and conquering. I will be supporting a presentation on executive functioning that is part of the Connections California series. This is particularly when we talk about age 14 and above for transition. Parents Helping Parents is kind of doing a lot of that really good work. So when you click through the slides, you'll see a link that you can follow to register if you're interested in that, also free. This is the Spanish advertisement for that same program. Again, it's in conflict with the CalAble Spanish presentation that we're doing locally. Pick wisely. And then we have an English CalAble presentation the following night, March 28th. 6:30 p.m. If you want to see me 3 nights in a row or 3 nights this week, here we are. We also offer a book circle, and I see at least one of our members, maybe a couple, 3, are here tonight, and we have a couple of groups going. We have our first Thursday of the month in the morning, and then we have our first Tuesday of the month in the evening. We read the book Disability Visibility. It is totally low stress. We read one little essay, and they're usually between like 2, 3, maybe 8, 9 pages long in a whole month. And we come together, and it's super fun. Book circle, if you're interested. We provide the book. Everything is free. And Joe is going to be hosting an acrylic paint pouring. I want to call it party, but it's not. I think there might be pizza too. Is there pizza? Joe's off camera. Again, no cost,
Lunch.
in person. Lunch, you said?
Yeah, I haven't quite nailed down what it's going to be for lunch, but we will be providing lunch. Maybe sandwiches, maybe pizza, something like that.
And so we have limited space available just because it's in a conference room, so we can only fit in however many people. If you are interested, you will want to get on that. And then this is our non-free, but there are ways to make it free. This is the Involved Exceptional Parents Day Conference. It is coming up next month, April 27th in Mission Valley. If your child is a Regional Center client, Regional Center is able to fund conference attendance for a parent once a year, up to $200, which magically the conference is $200. So you could use your Regional Center. You might have to create an IPP goal, but this is a vendored conference with Regional Center. If your child is not a Regional Center client, certainly you can register. If finances are an issue, please reach out to Joe Goyos and talk to him about some other alternatives for some funds. So our keynote speaker is Laura Keller, who is a former San Diego Unified ombudsperson. She's also a parent. She helped to create our Family Empowerment Center, EFRC, and there are just a number of really great workshops. There's one on, I don't want to even list them because I'll leave something important out, but really any way that you think about disability, there will be an opportunity, including IEP experience that you won't want to miss.
Maura, I was